Hi everyone. Sorry I can't be there with you this week. I do feel like hell. That's why I don't have my video showing, so you don't have to look at me. Anyway, I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about vocabulary, touch bases. I actually have open our 208 week 8 presentation. Just because I want to go through and just remind you of some things, and I'm going to show you really quickly here how you can find that. If you go to our website, remember, under the home button is where you can find our Teach 204 and Teach 208 content. And then once you're there, scroll down to articles, handouts, and presentations, and then you'll be able to scroll down to week 8 and access the presentation that way, okay? So that is there for you. The other thing that you may want to have handy is, let's see, where is it? If I go back home and then I go to combined weekly calendar for 209, I've added in a handout for you that's right underneath where I will be putting this video. The video isn't there yet, but you can see right here the modified vocabulary knowledge scale. And so you may want to have that open because that's an assessment that I'm going to walk you through and I'm going to ask you to implement ideally on Thursday. So just in terms of vocabulary, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. You have access to this. We talked about this in 208, and you've now read the chapter on vocabulary in the Wager et al. Text. So this is just sort of to help you, kind of sediment some of these ideas and recall what we did in 208. So remember that we have degrees of, sorry, I'm making you dizzy, I'm sure. We have degrees of word knowledge, right? And we talked about that. They're sort of like knowing people. And the assessment that I'm going to ask you to be doing on Thursday sort of builds on that. It's going to be, the student is going to sort of self-assess their vocabulary knowledge according to different degrees, right? When we're talking about vocabulary, we're talking about all of these things. You can see that because there's an emphasis on morphology, that it's very closely tied to word study. But typically in word study, and in Words Their Way, although you don't completely ignore meaning, it's really more focused on orthographic mapping and on orthography or spelling patterns, right? Whereas this is, while it doesn't ignore that, it's really more focused on the meanings of words and phrases. So we talked about cognates. You've got here some examples here. I'm going to be having you implement what's called the modified vocabulary knowledge scale. And I would invite you to, as you implement it, to engage with your student in conversations about cognates. For example, if they're sort of reading different words and gauging their own understanding, you might ask them if it is a cognate, if they know a part of the word, right? Maybe ask them if they use that strategy or if they're even aware of it. Tiers of vocabulary. So this is really important. And last semester I had you picking out some some vocabulary from the last, either from a text I gave your group or from the last Quintista. Now I can't remember. But if you recall, tier 1 words are very sort of everyday high frequency. We typically don't need to spend much time teaching them. They're very contextualized as well. But tier 2 words are often more complex and used across contents and disciplines. They're not as hyper-specific as tier 3 words. So we get a lot of mileage out of teaching tier 2 words. And so when you engage in your modified vocabulary knowledge scale, I'm going to encourage you to pick out tier 2 words that you think your student won't know, and or were even actually more important would be words that are important for understanding what you're about to have them read. So you're going to be pulling words out of an actual text. We'll get there. But you're going to be, generally speaking, targeting 2-tier words. Now, I say generally speaking because I think what I'll do is switch over to this other presentation really quick. You may have remembered last semester I showed you this meme. And this is a really good example. It says, as an American citizen, you have the right to bear arms. Right, bear, and arms are all classically tier 1 words. However, when we use them in new context, or when the context changes to, for example, talking about constitutional law, or the meanings of the words change, right? So bear arms, as a phrase, means to carry weapons, right? And so the meanings of those words change. It's no longer like oso and brazos, right? So that means when you are teaching vocabulary, particularly when you're having contextualized vocabulary conversations with your students and when you're assessing vocabulary, it's important to go beyond tiers. So tiers are very important. Again, you're generally going to be targeting tier 2, but for example, there's arm here in tier 1, but remember, that could actually probably move to a tier 2 word in terms of understanding its meaning as soon as we talk about the right to bear arms. So what I want to do with you right now is go over the modified vocabulary knowledge scale. And again, this is accessible in the same place that you access our weekly presentations in our class website. You can access it there. So the nice thing about this assessment, which I'm going to be asking you to engage your students with on Thursday, is that it's contextualized with an actual text that they're going to be reading. So, and it's also students self-reporting their knowledge of words. So you can do this as a pre-assessment right before reading a book or engaging in a unit. You can also do this if you want, like on Thursday, right before orally recording your student reading aloud and doing a retell or what have you. But you don't have to. You can also do it as a separate activity, but you're always going to do it with a particular book. So the idea with this, there are 3 ways of doing it, and I'm going to be walking you through first the decontextualized one, and any one of these approaches is fine, but they're different, so you get to pick. So the idea here is that in the decontextualized version, you pick a text that's at approximately the student's instructional level or just above, right? It doesn't really have to be a content area text. I mean, you could do this with the last Quintista or something else the kids are reading that's approximately at their level. But the idea is that you are going to pick out several words. I typically don't do as many as 15. I usually do 8 to 10. And I try to do maybe 1 or 2 cognates in there, but not too many. And I pick out words that are not only tier 2, but also or that are necessary for them for comprehending the text, that they really need to know what that word means. So I'm picking them, and then even though this is contextualized in the sense that you are pulling these from a book they're about to read, it's decontextualized as you go through the assessment because you're presenting these words to the student out of context, like they're written on a separate piece of paper. And then you ask your student to go through these questions. So that's and then you score it. We'll talk about scoring in a minute. So that's the scoring, the decontextualized approach. Now, the one drawback of this, even though it's fast, that's a benefit, one of the drawbacks is that we typically don't just read words, right? Like we read words when they're in text. So it's not very authentic. If you want to make this a more authentic activity, you might consider the contextualized teacher-led approach. So in the contextualized teacher-led approach, you use the same text and the same words, but this time, instead of having them on a separate piece of paper, you put highlighter tape over the words you identified, right? Or if you have a photocopy of it, you can actually highlight the words. And then you ask the student to find each of the highlighted words. This is actually before reading the text, right? And then as they find each highlighted word, they respond to these questions above. This will likely be easier because it's contextualized, so they may, like, lickety-split kind of read around the word, or maybe they know what the text is about, and so that helps them know what the word is, right? But it's also more indicative of their ability to understand vocabulary while reading. In other words, it's more authentic. Now, let's say that even though you have a handle on tier 2 words and you kind of understand all of this, let's say that you still just aren't really sure how to predict what words your student may find challenging. You can do a contextualized student-led approach. You could actually try different approaches on different days if you want, but you need to do this assessment, one form of this at least once. But the idea is that using the same text, you're not presenting any words to the student in advance. I would recommend that you still identify some words in advance, but you're not presenting them to the student. Instead, the student is just going to be going to start reading the text, and is going to place highlighter tape over or highlight each word that they don't know. And then once they've finished reading, you can then go back and revisit these words, and you can ask the student to engage in these questions. This is going to give you a better sense of the student's contextualized vocabulary knowledge, as well as how they may problem solve on the run. So sometimes they'll miscue and they'll figure out a word, and then afterwards you can go back and ask them how they figured it out, right? So it's more time consuming, but again, it's much more authentic. These are some general guidelines in scoring, but I want to invite you to consider what other modifications, either to the assessment or to the scoring, you might want to make based on your students' multilingualism. So, for example, you'd have to redo the scoring, but you could add in a prompt or embed a prompt maybe in one of these questions or statements that gets at cognate. So, for example, I don't remember having seen this word before, even in Spanish, right? Or I have seen this word before in English or in Spanish, but I don't think I know what it means, right? So you might consider those kinds of adaptations. I would encourage you to engage in conversations with your student during and or after the assessment, where you can talk about whether they know cognate strategy and stuff like that. Other things you can do is you can ask students to sort the words according to certain categories. So in nonfiction, if you're looking at insects or something like that, you could categorize them into body parts, habitats, life cycles, so put words under those categories. With fiction, you might consider they could categorize words according to story elements like characters, setting, action, resolution. Other kinds of assessments include photocopying or taking a picture from an illustrated text that they're going to read, and then having them just talk about it and elicit vocabulary, and then labeling or diagramming those illustrations. And then they have that vocabulary, they can then recognize what it looks like in print. And then finally, I want to show you this. This is it's just a website. Let's see if it'll load, where they articulate an approach to using this vocabulary rating guide that's really uses it not just for assessment, but also as an instructional activity. And I think it looks like a pretty useful way of doing this. So feel free to do that. You can still use instructional engagements as assessments, right? It doesn't have to be a straight assessment. You can learn about your student in any instructional activity. And then there are also some really nice examples you can see of how, you might put some of those prompts into a graphic organizer or checklist and things like that. So I just wanted to show that to you. So I think with that, I'm done. Let me know if you have any questions. I might see you on Thursday, but I think Allison Meyer is going to be working with you on Thursday. Be sure to check the weekly schedule, and also or the weekly calendar for readings, and also be absolutely sure that you complete your assessment plan. See ya!